Welcome to Restory Nights, where history helps you fall asleep. In the hush of a restless America, the 1920s began like a champagne bubble, bright, wild, and full of promise. From hidden speakeasies echoing with jazz to silent film theaters glowing in silver light, life in the roaring decade felt like a dream in motion. Tonight, let's drift back to that glittering age where modern America first learned to dance.
The city is half awake. It's early 1920-something, and America is stretching its arms like a sleepy giant who finally got a good night's rest after a long, messy dream called World War I. Streetlights buzz, a Model T rattles by, and the smell of roasted coffee slips out from a corner cafe. Somewhere upstairs, a radio coughs to life, searching for a voice. This is how the decade began. Not with fireworks, but with a hum that said, "Let's start again." The country had just survived the unthinkable. Millions of soldiers came home from foreign trenches, carrying new habits, new slang, and a new kind of swagger. They were done being serious. The world had almost ended once. No one felt like wasting time anymore. And just like that, America woke up. A bit dizzy, a bit broke, but full of ideas. A new morning. Imagine standing on a 1920s street corner. You'd see horse-drawn carts still clinging to their last days, right next to shiny automobiles puffing proud little clouds of exhaust. Old and new side by side, like neighbors pretending to like each other. Telegraph lines still hung overhead, but a few bold shops already had a "telephone inside" sign painted on the window. If you could listen closely, you'd hear two eras talking over each other, the clip-clap of horses arguing with the honk of a Ford. And somehow, that noise became music. There was an electricity in the air, literally and emotionally. Cities were glowing brighter every night. Street lamps replaced gas lights. Elevators hummed inside the first skyscrapers. The world was no longer lit by fire, but by filament. People felt unstoppable. Someone once wrote that the 1920s were a world trading horses for engines, telegrams for telephones, and you could feel that trade everywhere. The mood of the nation. After years of war headlines and ration cards, Americans wanted fun. They wanted jazz, laughter, and a reason to dress up again. Optimism wasn't just a feeling, it was a fashion trend. Men rolled up their sleeves, women cut their hair short, and smiled like they'd just discovered a secret. The rules that once held everyone in tight collars were starting to loosen, one dance step at a time. And yet, under all that change, there was a quiet truth. Nobody knew where it was all heading. They just knew they didn't want to go back. Imagine being 25 in 1921. Your parents still talk about proper manners, but you just bought a record player and love a song your mother calls noise. You smile, because for the first time, you don't care. That was the real rebellion, not with guns or protests, but with style and sound. From stillness to motion. Before the war, life moved slow. Letters took days, gossip took weeks, and travel was something you planned, not something you did on a whim. But the 1920s, suddenly everything was moving. Trains raced across the country, cars doubled their numbers every few years, and airplanes, those fragile little metal birds, began to make people dream of the sky. Even ideas moved faster. Magazines carried new slang, new fashion, new hope. You could pick up a copy of the Saturday Evening Post and read about inventions you didn't know you needed yet. Washing machines, toasters, electric fans, the miracle gadgets that promised to give you more free time, even though most people just filled that time with more work. Still, it felt modern. Even farmers out in the countryside started saving for radios. One farmer famously said, "If I can't have running water, at least I can have jazz." A cultural shift. You can almost feel the Victorian world sliding off America's shoulders. The polite whispers and heavy dresses of the 1910s were giving way to laughter, light skirts, and shorter haircuts. People were no longer afraid of being seen enjoying themselves. Women started driving, dancing, and working in offices. Men traded stiff collars for soft caps. Children suddenly had cartoons, and everyone had opinions about movies, about baseball, about that new talking box called radio. Society was loosening up, one laugh at a time. It wasn't perfect, of course. Not everyone approved. The older generation clucked their tongues and muttered that civilization was ending, which in fairness, people have said every decade since time began. But the young didn't care. They were too busy living the future, one Charleston dance and one jazz tune at a time. A day in the new America. Picture an average morning in 1922. A milkman clinks bottles on a porch. The newspaper headline screams about Babe Ruth or some new Hollywood star. Down the block, a man in suspenders is already late for his job at the Ford plant, muttering about traffic that didn't exist 5 years ago. Inside a house, a woman hums while winding the gramophone. The song? Ain't We Got Fun? Perfect title for the decade, really. At night, couples stroll past glowing shop windows. In some small apartment, a group of friends gathers around a radio to hear a boxing match broadcast live, a miracle of sound that makes the living room feel like Madison Square Garden. Someone laughs, someone sighs, someone says, "Imagine what things will be like in another 10 years." Nobody could imagine, not yet. The roar before the roar. The phrase Roaring Twenties didn't appear right away. At first, it was just the 20s, a nickname that felt plain and harmless. The roar came later, after the jazz bands, the parties, and the headlines made it impossible to ignore. But even here, in the early part of the decade, you can hear the first growl, the low rumble of engines, the chatter of new ideas, the clinking of glasses behind unmarked speakeasy doors. America was about to dance louder than ever before. A hint of humor. Of course, not everyone was impressed. One small-town preacher reportedly said, if God wanted women to dance the Charleston, he'd give them stronger ankles. Another newspaper complained that automobiles encourage moral looseness, which honestly was just the 1920s way of saying teens are making out in cars. People laughed, quietly, of course, because deep down, they knew the world was changing faster than anyone could stop it. Closing scene. So there you have it, dawn in the 1920s. A world rubbing its eyes, shaking off old dust, and reaching for something thrillingly new. You can almost see the sunlight hitting the glass of a New York skyscraper for the first time. A newspaper flutters down the street, landing in a puddle beside a Model T. A woman in a hat hurries past, clutching her purse and smiling at nothing in particular. America is awake. The day has just begun. And somewhere in that golden light, the new decade roars. Not loudly, not yet, but with the quiet promise of everything that's about to come.
If you stood on a street corner in 1922, the first thing you'd notice is the noise. Not chaos, just busy. America had found its rhythm, and the streets were its heartbeat. Horses hadn't completely vanished yet, but they looked awkward now, like old men at a youth party. They stood beside shiny new Fords, blinking at the honking monsters that had replaced them. The air carried a mix of oil, perfume, and roasted peanuts from a street vendor who probably yelled louder than the traffic. It wasn't quiet anymore, but no one wanted quiet. Quiet was old-fashioned. City life on the rise. The 1920s were when the American city stopped being a place you went to and became a place you belonged. New York, Chicago, Detroit, these weren't just cities. They were living, breathing engines of ambition. You could feel opportunity in the air, thick as smoke from a factory chimney. Streetcars clanged down the rails. Neon signs flickered to life after dark. People hurried everywhere, like they were afraid the future might leave without them. And in a way, it might have. Immigrants poured poured in from Europe, looking for a piece of the American dream, or at least a stable job that didn't involve dodging bullets. Rural families packed up wagons and moved to the cities, chasing paychecks instead of crops. For the first time, more Americans lived in cities than on farms. It wasn't just population, it was identity. The United States was no longer a country of farmers. It was becoming a country of dreamers. Skyscrapers and streetlights. Walk through downtown New York in 1923 and you'd see something astonishing. The sky was shrinking. Steel giants were rising everywhere. The Woolworth Building, the Chrysler Building, the Empire State under construction. Each one taller, shinier, more arrogant than the last. Builders joked that soon they'd bump into heaven and have to apologize. At night, electric lights glowed from every window. Even small towns got their first street lamps. And for people who'd grown up with lanterns, it was nothing short of magic. Imagine standing under a lamp that doesn't flicker or smoke, hearing jazz from a passing car, and realizing the dark will never be as dark again. That was progress you could see. But for every sparkle, there was sweat. Factories roared like dragons. The smell of metal and oil clung to the workers long after their shifts ended. 12-hour days were slowly shrinking to 8, but weekend was a new idea. A machinist might earn $25 a week, a secretary maybe half that. But for many, it was more money than they'd ever touched before. People bought their first coats, their first radios, even their first ice boxes. They started to believe in a strange new word, consumer. America was no longer just making things. It was learning to want things. The pulse of everyday life. The 1920 street was like a theater, and everyone had a role. Paperboys shouted headlines about the Yankees. Taxi drivers leaned on their horns like it was a second language. Salesmen carried suitcases full of samples, socks, razors, perfume, hope. Everywhere you turned, someone was selling something. Buy now, pay later, said the posters. Credit was the newest invention of all, the art of getting what you want before you can afford it. A fine idea, until 1929, but let's not spoil the mood yet. In barbershops, men argued about Babe Ruth. In diners, women whispered about movie stars like Rudolph Valentino. And in the streets, jazz bands played for coins, the sound bouncing off brick walls and mixing with the laughter of passing strangers. If sound could dance, it would have been born in the 1920s. Fashion meets pavement. You couldn't walk half a block without noticing how different everyone looked. Women wore shorter skirts and bobbed hair, showing off ankles that old men fainted in disbelief. Men traded stiff hats for soft fedoras, and the younger ones rolled up their sleeves like rebels. Even the mannequins in shop windows looked livelier, like they knew they were part of a cultural revolution. It wasn't just fashion, it was freedom stitched into fabric. Clothes said, "We're not our parents anymore." Rural versus urban, the great divide. Of course, not everyone was clinking glasses and riding elevators. While the cities glowed, the country sighed. Rural America watched the lights from afar, unsure if it should admire or fear them. Farmers complained that jazz was corrupting morals and that women were getting too modern. Meanwhile, city folks joked that country people thought electricity was witchcraft. There was truth in both. The distance wasn't just miles, it was mindset. The 1920s created a new kind of America, split between those who moved fast and those who stood still. Still, on Sunday mornings, everyone heard the same church bells. Progress hadn't broken everything apart. Not yet. A nighttime walk. Let's take a quiet walk through a 1920 city street at night. Streetlights glow amber against wet cobblestones. Storefront windows display mannequins frozen in mid-dance. Somewhere, a phonograph hums out, "I'll see you in my dreams." A young couple passes by whispering plans they don't have the money for. A police officer tips his hat to a woman in a cloche hat. A bootlegger's truck rumbles softly down an alley, its cargo clinking in rhythm. Every sound, every light feels new, like the world is rehearsing for modern life. You can almost sense it, the mix of hope and hurry, of nerves and novelty. The street isn't just a road anymore, it's a runway to the future. Still, city life wasn't all glamour. Potholes existed, even in 1923. Pedestrians dodged horse droppings one minute and oil slicks the next. Progress has a funny sense of irony. One reporter complained, "New York smells like gasoline and pancakes," which, to be honest, sounds deliciously confusing. And then there were the cars. People loved them until they tried to park. Early drivers were famous for bumping every other car on the street, calling it gentle tapping. Traffic cops learned new hand signals, mostly variations of "stop" and "for heaven's sake, stop." Even chaos had its charm. Closing scene. As the 1920s marched on, cities grew taller, brighter, louder. People hurried through life like they were late for something they couldn't name. From skyscraper rooftops to speakeasy basements, every brick seemed to hum with the same promise. The future is here, and it's going to be wild. Soft jazz rises, distant laughter fades into the hum of a city night. And so the streets of America changed forever. They became symbols of progress, of dreams, of restless motion. But the story of this decade isn't just in the streets, it's in the people walking them.
If the streets were the heartbeat of the 1920s, then the people were its pulse. Fast, funny, curious, and a little bit reckless. Everyone was in a hurry to live. Maybe because they'd seen how easily life could vanish during the war. Maybe because, for the first time, they could actually choose what kind of life they wanted. Either way, America in the 1920s was full of motion, and every person seemed to be running towards something, even if they didn't quite know what. A nation of characters. Let's take a walk, shall we? Imagine you're strolling through a 1920s neighborhood. Brick houses lined up shoulder to shoulder, smoke rising from chimneys, the smell of coffee and car exhaust blending in the morning air. There's the factory worker whistling his way to the plant, lunch pail swinging. He doesn't love his job, but he loves his paycheck and the fact that he finally owns a wristwatch. His father had a pocket watch. He's got progress strapped to his arm. Down the block, the secretary in her crisp white blouse locks her apartment door. She's only 20, but she types faster than any man in the office, though she still gets paid half as much. She rolls her eyes at that, but she also knows something's shifting. For the first time, women like her don't just dream, they plan. And at the corner cafe, the jazz musician tuned his trumpet for the evening gig. He doesn't own much, but when he plays, the whole room listens. His music doesn't care about color or class. It's the one thing in the decade that truly belongs to everyone. The flapper and the gentleman. The 1920s woman was a walking revolution. Gone were the corsets and the long skirts. In came the short hair, the loose dresses, the bold lipstick, and that famous look, confidence. They called her the flapper. She danced, she smoked, she drove, and she laughed too loud. Men called her wild, she called it freedom. Picture her stepping out of a cab, feathered headband tilted, heels clicking on the sidewalk. Somewhere nearby, an old man sighs, "The world's gone mad." She grins, lights a cigarette, and keeps walking. And the men? Well, they were changing too. The formal, stiff collars of the early 1900s gave way to a more relaxed style. Softer fabrics, looser ties, even sport coats. A 1920s gentleman was half businessman, half adventurer. He worked by day, danced by night, and carried a flask just in case the night got interesting. Together, flappers and gents turned the decade into a dance, quick, daring, and slightly tipsy. The working class? Of course, not everyone was sipping champagne and dancing in speakeasies. For millions, the 1920s were about hard work and harder luck. In the factories of Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Chicago, workers labored over engines and steel for long hours. Coal dust stuck to their hands like tattoos that never washed off. But they were proud to be part of something big, something industrial, something modern. One worker in a Ford factory reportedly said, "We build cars faster than people can crash them." It was half joke, half truth. Assembly lines were miracles of motion, and men moved like clockwork. The pay wasn't great, but it was enough for rent, a radio, and maybe, just maybe, a trip to the cinema on weekends. For many, that was luxury. The immigrant dream. The 1920s were also the years when the world came knocking on America's door, and America, mostly, opened it. Immigrants from Italy, Ireland, Poland, and beyond filled the cities with new voices, new smells, new dreams. In New York's Lower East Side, you could walk down one block and hear 5 languages, none of which you'd understand, but all of which somehow sounded like hope. These new Americans worked long hours in factories, laundries, or bakeries. They saved every coin, sent money home, and told their kids to learn English and be somebody. Their story wasn't glamorous, but it was the backbone of the decade. The skyscrapers, the cars, the jazz clubs, they were all built by calloused hands and stubborn hearts. The dreamers and the doubters. Not everyone believed in the modern age. Some folks missed the old world, the slow pace, the quiet nights, the familiar order of things. Small-town America clung to its traditions. Sunday church, family dinners, polite manners. In a way, they were the brakes on a nation speeding into the unknown. You can almost imagine the conversations at dinner tables. Girls wearing skirts above the knee? Disgraceful. Music made by horns and drums? That's not music, that's noise. Movies? Just shadows pretending to be people. And yet those same people secretly peeked at movie posters on their way home. Progress has a funny way of converting its critics. Children of the new century. If you were a kid in the 1920s, life was a wonderland. You had Mickey Mouse, Raggedy Ann dolls, radio shows, and new playgrounds popping up in cities. You'd sneak into movie theaters for a nickel and laugh until you forgot the world was changing. Teenagers, meanwhile, were discovering rebellion. Cars gave them freedom and privacy. Parents hated both. Soda shops became the new hangouts, where kids drank milkshakes and talked about baseball, not farming. A father in 1925 said, "I don't understand my boy." A father in 2025 probably says the same thing. Some things never change. The colors of a changing nation. Let's not forget the people who carried America's rhythm, Black Americans migrating north during the Great Migration. They brought their culture, poetry, and above all, their music. Jazz, blues, gospel, the heartbeat of the decade. Harlem in New York became the cultural capital of Black creativity. Langston Hughes wrote poetry that felt like music, and Louis Armstrong played music that felt like poetry. It wasn't an easy life. Racism was still brutal. But through the struggle came art, and through art came pride. The 1920s weren't just roaring, they were singing. A quiet reflection. When you step back and look at the 1920s crowd, the flapper, the worker, the dreamer, the immigrant, the artist, you realize something beautiful. They were all trying to build a version of happiness they hadn't seen before. They didn't know it, but they were laying the blueprint for modern America. Noisy, hopeful, flawed, and endlessly creative. And maybe that's why we still love this decade so much. It was the first time ordinary people believed that ordinary life could be extraordinary. Tomorrow we'll peek behind one of their doors to see what life was really like inside a 1920s home.
Let's step quietly inside a home from the 1920s. Not a mansion, just an ordinary American house. The kind you'd find on the edge of a growing town. A white porch, a squeaky screen door, and maybe a Model T parked proudly out front. The first thing you notice? The smell. A mix of coffee, floor polish, and something baking in the kitchen. It's not fancy, but it's home. Morning in the new modern world. The day starts early. The alarm clock rattles like it's angry at the world.
and someone yells, "Turn that thing off!" That thing, by the way, is a big deal because 10 years ago, most people didn't even own a mechanical alarm clock. The father, usually wearing suspenders and a smile that says 5 more minutes, shuffles to the bathroom, where the miracle of indoor plumbing still feels futuristic. The mother's already in the kitchen, flipping pancakes while humming a tune from the radio. She might not admit it, but she's proud of that radio. It's the family's newest treasure, a talking box that brings in news, music, and sometimes a man telling jokes that make Grandpa shake his head. On the kitchen table, oatmeal, eggs, and a newspaper with bold black headlines. Maybe it says something about Wall Street, or maybe about prohibition raids. Either way, the coffee's stronger than the news. The heart of the home. Every house in the 1920s had one true heart, the living room, or as some called it, the parlor. It's where families gathered after dinner, where the radio lived, where the good chairs were. There's a ticking clock on the mantle, a framed photograph of someone looking very serious, and a potted plant that hadn't been watered in a week but refuses to die. The furniture was heavy, built to last. You could drop it from a rooftop and it would probably survive. Sofas were covered in floral fabric, and lace doilies appeared everywhere like some sort of 1920s law required them. And if you were a guest, you better not sit on the fancy couch without permission. Electric dreams. Now that was magic. By the 1920s, most city homes had it. Rural ones, not so much, but people were dreaming about it. Lights that flicked on with a click, fans that spun without winding, heaven. Refrigerators, though, those were still rare. Most folks still used an ice box, which was literally a box with a chunk of ice in it. The Iceman came by once or twice a week, hauling blocks on his shoulder. Kids loved watching him, mostly because he'd sometimes chip off a piece for them to suck on during hot days. And telephones? Ooh, those were a show-off piece. If your house had one, it usually sat proudly on a hallway table with a long curly cord and a heavy receiver that doubled as a weapon if you dropped it on your foot. The kitchen kingdom. Now the kitchen, that was the command center. No sleek microwaves or chrome appliances here. Instead, you'd find a sturdy wood stove that burned coal or gas, shelves full of tin cans, and maybe, if the family was doing well, a shiny new toaster. Cooking took time and muscle. No instant coffee, no quick dinners. Bread was kneaded by hand, and soup simmered half the day. But the smell, worth every minute. If you were a kid, this was where you'd sneak cookies or where you'd hide when your report card didn't look so great. The mother was the queen of this space. Even in a decade of change, most women still ruled the home, although many were beginning to question why that was their only kingdom. You can almost hear one sigh, maybe someday they'll invent something that washes dishes for me. Spoiler, they did. It just took a few more decades. Bedroom stories. The bedrooms were small but cozy. Sheets crisp and white, iron bed frames that creaked louder than thunder, and a quilt that had seen 3 generations. There might be a Bible on the nightstand, or a stack of love letters tied with a ribbon. Children often shared rooms, 2, sometimes 3 in a bed, giggling until one of them snored. Toys were simple, a doll, a wooden train, or a yo-yo, but imagination was unlimited. And if you looked closely, under one pillow, you might find a small diary full of secrets, crushes, and dreams about the future. The evening glow. After a long day, the house came alive in the evenings. Dad would read the newspaper, occasionally muttering, "What's the world coming to?" while Mom did a bit of sewing. Kids sprawled on the floor, listening to the radio, maybe a program by the Lucky Strike Hour or a detective story that ended just before bedtime. The warm orange light of a table lamp spread across the room, shadows dancing on the walls.
The world outside was moving fast, but in here, time slowed down. The hidden corners. Every 1920s home had its quirks. A creaky stair, a loose window latch, a picture slightly crooked that nobody dared fix. And of course, a secret stash of something. Maybe candy, maybe cash, maybe a bottle of forbidden whiskey hidden behind the flour tin. Because remember, it's Prohibition time. Technically, alcohol is illegal. Realistically, well, let's just say Aunt Mabel's medicine smells suspiciously like gin. The neighborhood pulse. Outside, the houses formed a community. Neighbors borrowed sugar, kids played stickball in the street, and someone's dog always barked at the mailman like it was his full-time job. Saturday evenings often meant porch gatherings. Men smoked pipes, women shared gossip, and kids chased lightning bugs until bedtime. No smartphones, no screens, just people talking, laughing, living. Simple, but rich. A gentle reflection. When you picture this home, the laughter, the smells, the ticking clock, it's easy to see why the 1920s felt so full of hope. Even with all its challenges, life felt fresh. The world was smaller, but the dreams were big. Inside these homes, America wasn't roaring. It was humming softly. The sound of comfort, of family, of ordinary lives quietly building the future. So tonight, as we leave that cozy living room and step back into the moonlit street, remember, history doesn't just live in the headlines. It lives in homes, in bedtime stories, in the quiet spaces where life truly happens.
If you could close your eyes and listen to the 1920s, you'd hear more than just noise. You'd hear life itself, a rhythm rising out of the cities, tapping its foot to a new kind of music. Cars rumbled, typewriters clicked, radios hummed, and somewhere from a smoky room on a Saturday night, a trumpet cried out, sweet, wild, and free. That sound was jazz, and jazz was the heartbeat of the decade. When the world started to swing, nobody really planned for jazz to take over. It just showed up, like the life of the party who didn't need an invitation. It came from the deep roots of African American culture, blues, ragtime, gospel, and street rhythm, and it grew through the hands and lungs of musicians who played what they felt, not what they read. It was improvised, it was alive, and for a generation learning to dance after years of war and worry, it felt like freedom in sound form. Cities like New Orleans, Chicago, and New York became the new temples of rhythm. Every corner had a club, every club had a band, and every band had a story. Louis Armstrong blew his trumpet like it could talk. Duke Ellington made pianos sound like rain. Bessie Smith sang heartbreak in a way that made even the drunks go quiet. And if you wandered past a speakeasy, you'd hear that unmistakable rhythm, the syncopation that made even the shyest feet move. The magic box called the radio. But jazz didn't stay trapped inside smoky bars. It escaped through a miracle called the radio. Before radio, music lived in theaters or records that cost too much for most families. But now, for the price of electricity, you could fill your living room with sound. People would gather around the radio like a campfire. Kids sat cross-legged, moms folded laundry, dads leaned back in their chairs, and the whole house glowed with a warm, invisible current of connection. The first time someone heard a live jazz performance broadcast into their home, they probably gasped. It was magic. Real-time sound traveling across miles of wire and air. And it wasn't just music. The radio brought everything: comedy shows, sports, dramas, and breaking news. When Babe Ruth hit a home run, you could hear the crowd roar, even if you lived 500 miles away. When President Coolidge gave a speech, you didn't have to read it tomorrow. You could hear it tonight. It was the 1920s version of scrolling through your feed, but with better manners and fewer conspiracy theories. The birth of pop culture. Radio didn't just spread sound, it spread ideas. Suddenly, everyone was hearing the same songs, the same jokes, the same advertisements. That's how pop culture was born. A kid in Kansas and a kid in New York could both hum the same tune. Housewives swapped radio recipes. Teenagers argued over which singer had the better voice. Even slang started spreading faster. Words like swell, hotsy-totsy, and the cat's pajamas zipped across the airwaves. Still waiting for the cat's pajamas to make a comeback, honestly. Celebrities, too, became a new kind of royalty. Jazz musicians, radio hosts, and silent film stars, they weren't just entertainers. They were symbols of the new modern life. For the first time in history, fame could travel faster than a train. The dance fever. Of course, once you had jazz, you needed a way to move to it. Enter the dance craze. The Charleston, the Lindy Hop, the Foxtrot. Even people who swore they had two left feet couldn't resist trying. Dance halls exploded in popularity. Couples spun under glittering chandeliers, their laughter mixing with trumpets and drums. It wasn't just fun, it was rebellion in rhythm. Older generations said the dances were scandalous, too wild, they said, too close. But that was kind of the point. For young Americans, dancing wasn't just movement, it was a statement. We survived the war. We want to feel alive. And feel alive they did. Every step, every spin, every shared smile across the floor. The records that never slept. Let's not forget another player in this new world of sound, the phonograph. By the 1920s, record players were becoming more affordable, and suddenly, music could live in your home without a live band. Shellac discs, heavy, fragile, and full of crackle, carried voices that might never visit your town otherwise. Families built small collections, a few jazz records, a love ballad, maybe even a marching tune. And if you listened late at night, the soft hiss between songs almost felt like whispers from another world. When music met movies. Then came the great leap, sound in film. Before the late 1920s, movies were silent. Actors mouthed words while live musicians played in the theater. But then came The Jazz Singer in 1927, the first feature-length film with synchronized sound. Audiences were stunned. Some cried, some screamed, everyone clapped. They were hearing voices that belonged to faces for the first time. It changed everything. The soundy movies transformed Hollywood overnight, and music and film began their lifelong marriage. The silver screen wasn't silent anymore. It could sing. A nation in tune. Music has a funny way of showing what a nation feels, and in the 1920s, America was buzzing, full of hope, rhythm, and restlessness. The jazz beat was more than entertainment. It was a declaration. We're done being quiet. We're ready to live loudly, laugh freely, and dance into the unknown. Even the radio static felt exciting, like a promise that something new was always coming next. It didn't matter if you were rich or poor, black or white, city or country. When that melody played, for a few minutes, you were all part of the same song. A quiet reflection. If you listen carefully tonight, maybe you can still hear it, faintly, like a ghost of rhythm in the air. The trumpets echo, the laughter behind a microphone, the slow hum of a world discovering itself through sound. The 1920s didn't just invent pop culture, it gave life a soundtrack, and every generation since has been dancing to its beat.
It's 1920. The Great War is over, jazz is on the rise, cars are clogging the streets, And America has just done something bold. It banned alcohol. That's right. The country that celebrated every victory with champagne suddenly decided that a glass of beer was a national threat. It was called Prohibition, a law meant to make America sober, moral, and clean. What it actually made was creative. Because, as history would soon discover, when you tell millions of people they can't drink, they don't stop drinking. They just get better at hiding it. The dry law that created a wet country. In 1920, the 18th Amendment officially went into effect, banning the manufacture, sale, and transport of alcohol. The idea came from years of moral campaigning, mostly by church groups and temperance leagues, who believed liquor was ruining families and society. And to be fair, they weren't entirely wrong. Before Prohibition, alcoholism was a huge problem. Drunken brawls, domestic violence, wasted paychecks, it was bad. So when the ban arrived, many Americans cheered. They imagined peaceful streets, responsible fathers, and polite Sunday dinners. But instead of peace came parties. Louder, wilder, and hidden from the law. Enter the speakeasy. The word speakeasy sounds polite, doesn't it? Like a library with cocktails. In truth, it was the 1920s version of a secret club. These underground bars popped up everywhere, in basements, behind grocery stores, inside barber shops, even in old warehouses. To get in, you needed a password. Something like, "Joe sent me," or "I'm here for the flowers." Once inside, the world changed. Dim lights, laughter, cigarette smoke curling through jazz melodies. Men in suits, women in sparkly dresses, and in the corner, a bartender pouring gin that could probably take the paint off a wall. It wasn't good liquor, but it did the job. People weren't just drinking, they were rebelling. Quietly, stylishly, and with a sense of humor. The rise of the bootleggers. Now someone had to supply all that illegal booze. Enter the bootleggers, the new businessmen of the underground. They smuggled liquor from Canada, the Caribbean, and Europe, using everything from trucks to fishing boats. Some even made their own, the infamous bathtub gin. Yes, literally mixed in bathtubs. No, you didn't want to ask about the recipe. Among these entrepreneurs was one name that would become legendary: Al Capone. Capone turned Chicago into his personal empire, controlling breweries, distribution networks, and police bribes with frightening efficiency. He wasn't just selling alcohol. He was selling rebellion, convenience, and safety, if you stayed on his good side. They called him Scarface. The newspapers called him Rich. At his peak, Capone's business made over $60 million a year, tax-free, of course. Meanwhile, the average cop made about $1,500. You can do the math. The law versus the people. The government wasn't blind to what was happening. They created the Prohibition Bureau to crack down on illegal alcohol, but enforcement was nearly impossible. America had thousands of miles of borders and millions of thirsty citizens. Even worse, many of the enforcers liked to drink. Corruption spread faster than moonshine. One Chicago agent said, "I arrested the same bartender 3 times in 1 week. Each time, he was out before I got home." And honestly, most people didn't see it as a crime. If you were caught with whiskey, you didn't look like a criminal. You looked like someone who wanted to have fun. Prohibition turned half the country into outlaws, and the other half into hypocrites. Homemade hustle. Not everyone had access to fancy bootleggers, so regular Americans got crafty. They brewed beer in basements, fermented fruit in closets, and turned grape juice into family wine. Doctors prescribed medicinal whiskey by the gallon. Pharmacies suddenly became the most popular places in town. Even churches found loopholes. After all, sacramental wine was still legal. Let's just say communion attendance went way up. Women behind the bar. Here's a twist you might not expect. Prohibition helped women step into nightlife in new ways. Before the 1920s, respectable women rarely went to bars. But inside speakeasies, those lines blurred. Inside, women danced, drank, smoked, and laughed, not in secret shame, but in stylish rebellion. Flappers became the icons of this new freedom. Short skirts, bobbed hair, and a glass of gin in hand. In a strange way, the ban on alcohol helped loosen the social rules that had trapped women for decades. Maybe not what the moral reformers had in mind, but history has a sense of humor. The Great Irony. By the mid-1920s, it was clear that prohibition wasn't working. Crime was up, respect for the law was down, and the government was losing millions in tax revenue. Instead of saving families, the ban had built an empire of gangsters, smugglers, and secret drinkers. One newspaper joked, "The only thing prohibition prohibits is honesty." And truly, by 1930, almost no one took it seriously anymore. Even President Hoover quietly called it a noble experiment. And like most experiments, this one was failing spectacularly. The Last Call. Finally, in 1933, America raised its glass again. The 21st Amendment repealed prohibition, and the nation collectively sighed, "Thank goodness." Bars reopened, breweries restarted, and the government started collecting taxes on alcohol once more. Ironically, the moment people could drink legally again, they slowed down a bit. Maybe the thrill was gone. Or maybe, after 13 years of hiding and hustling, America was just tired. A gentle reflection. Looking back, prohibition feels less like a sober decade and more like a dance between morality and mischief. It showed how laws can't change desire, and how people, when pushed, will always find a way to laugh and drink and live on their own terms. And maybe that's the real heart of the 1920s. A country trying to draw boundaries, and a generation daring to cross them.
The 1920s were not just about flappers, jazz, and speakeasies. They were also about men who decided to make a fortune from the law they ignored, and sometimes bend the country to their will while they were at it. Enter the American gangster. The man in a fedora, a slick suit, a cigar that smelled like ambition, and pockets heavier than his conscience. Chicago was ground zero. The city's booming population, river access, and industrial might made it perfect for one thing: organized crime. Al Capone, the most famous gangster of all, wasn't just a thug. He was a businessman in a pinstripe suit. He ran breweries disguised as bakeries, and networks that delivered liquor faster than a mailman. Capone didn't just want money, he wanted respect. And in the 1920s, respect was currency. They say he had a barber on retainer, not for style, for loyalty. And his enemies? Let's just say they didn't argue much. The mafia's roots. The American mafia didn't spring up overnight. It came from immigrants, mostly Sicilians, who brought old-world codes with them. Loyalty, honor, secrecy, and revenge were part of the job description. Prohibition just gave them the perfect opportunity. Suddenly, the mafia wasn't small-time. It was a nation-spanning business with employees, suppliers, and customers, all operating in the shadows. These weren't just criminals. They were entrepreneurs of chaos, the business of crime. Being a gangster in the 1920s wasn't about robbing banks. That was risky and messy. The real money was in illegal liquor, and with that, they built empires.
They bribed police officers, politicians, and judges, which meant most people simply didn't see them as lawbreakers. Capone even gave back to the community, donating to charities and hosting Christmas dinners for the poor. This dual identity, feared by some, admired by others, is why gangsters became such legends. They weren't just criminals, they were the stars of their own story. The code of the streets. The gangster life wasn't all champagne and cigars. Violence was real, swift, and often public. Gang wars erupted over territory, rivalries, and sometimes just ego. Bootlegging routes were sacred, and betrayal was punished brutally. Yet, amidst the chaos, there was a strange code. Never mess with family, respect loyalty, and always keep your word. It was almost like a business ethic, with bullets. Famous faces. Besides Capone, there were other names that sent shivers down the nation's spine. Johnny Torrio, the quiet strategist, the mentor to Capone, a man who ran a criminal empire almost like clockwork. Bugsy Siegel, a future Las Vegas legend who made headlines with charisma and cold calculation. Dutch Schultz, ruthless, unpredictable, and unforgettable. These men didn't just make money, they made headlines, shaped cities, and carved stories into the American imagination. The glamour of the gangster era. Despite the blood and betrayal, gangsters had a weird glamour. Newspapers sensationalized them. Movies portrayed them as suave, clever, untouchable. Women wore dresses that sparkled like the Chicago skyline. Men polished their shoes while whispering about deals and heists. In Speakeasies, a gangster's presence was magnetic. He carried danger like cologne. People watched him because he embodied the decade, bold, modern, and impossible to ignore. Even the FBI, then the Bureau of Investigation, struggled to keep up. Crime had gone professional, national, and stylish. The dark side. Of course, it wasn't all glitter. Gangsters left destruction in their wake. Families were ruined, streets were unsafe, and public officials were compromised. Some neighborhoods lived in fear, waiting for the next execution, a term often used casually in headlines, but terrifying in reality. Even prohibition agents found themselves in over their heads, outnumbered and outgunned. Some took bribes, some got threats, and some never went home. The Mafia's legacy. By the end of the decade, the Mafia had done more than just make money. It had woven itself into American culture. Songs mentioned gangsters, movies dramatized them. Children whispered their names in awe. Newspapers fed the fascination. They were villains, heroes, and anti-heroes all at once. And in doing so, they made the 1920s unforgettable. A glimpse inside a gangster's life. Imagine stepping into a gangster's office. Leather chairs, a heavy desk, cigars burning slowly, whiskey on the table, probably illegal. Business papers scattered, a ledger open with numbers no ordinary accountant would touch. The air smells of ambition and gunpowder. A secretary takes notes, a driver waits outside, and somewhere the faint sound of jazz floats in from a nearby speakeasy, because even criminals like a soundtrack. It's chaotic, dangerous, and strangely orderly. A gentle reflection. The gangsters of the 1920s remind us something crucial. History isn't just about laws or politics. It's about people, the ones who bend the rules, push limits, and shape the culture in ways both good and bad. Prohibition created them. Opportunity nurtured them. And curiosity, our curiosity, keeps their stories alive. Tonight, as we leave the shadowed alleyways and dimly lit offices of the gangster world, remember, History is rarely black and white. It's smoky, jazzy, dangerous, and full of surprises.
The 18th Amendment has just gone into effect, banning the manufacture, sale, and transport of alcohol across the country. They called it Prohibition, a bold social experiment meant to clean up streets, strengthen families, and make America moral again. And it worked. Kind of. Just not in the way anyone expected. The law that sparked rebellion. The 18th Amendment was simple to read, but nearly impossible to enforce. No more beer, no more whiskey, no more gin. People were supposed to drink water, milk, or lemonade instead. But America had a long history with alcohol. People weren't about to give it up because a piece of paper said so. Instead, they got clever, they got creative, and they got secretive. The secret life of speakeasies. Enter the speakeasy, the hidden jewel of the 1920s nightlife. Speakeasies were everywhere. Basements, behind barber shops, inside groceries, even in a few churches if you were creative. To enter, you needed a password. Sometimes it was a phrase, sometimes just a secret knock. 3 taps on a door, pause, 2 taps, and the world outside vanished. Inside, the scene was magical. Jazz floated through smoky air. Flappers laughed and drank and danced like the night would never end. Men in suits sipped gin and whiskey, sharing stories and maybe a little bribe or two. It wasn't just about drinking. It was about feeling alive in a world that told you not to. A night inside. Picture a man approaching an unmarked door. He knocks. 3 quick raps, then a pause, then another 2. A small peephole opens. A voice whispers a word, and the door swings open. Inside, it's a world apart. The soft golden glow of lamps, a piano playing a syncopated rhythm, laughter bouncing off brick walls. The scent of gin mingles with cigarette smoke and perfume. He slips to the bar where the bartender pours something that looks suspiciously strong. The man takes a sip and smiles, not because of the alcohol, but because he feels part of something secret, daring, and alive. That's the paradox of Prohibition. The harder they tried to forbid it, the more desirable it became. Bootleggers and moonshine. Of course, someone had to supply this hidden world of indulgence. Bootleggers became the unspoken heroes of the decade. They smuggled liquor across state lines, from Canada, the Caribbean, or even from their own hidden stills. Then there was moonshine, homemade alcohol, brewed in basements, barns, or bathtubs. You never knew what you'd get. Smooth and strong, or explosive. Some families treated it like a science experiment gone rogue. These entrepreneurs thrived because demand was high and risk was higher. Every knock at the door could be a police raid, a rival gang, or a customer who drank too fast. Yet somehow it worked. America's thirst was unstoppable. The irony. Prohibition did exactly what it wasn't supposed to do. It made drinking glamorous. It made speakeasies fashionable. It made bootleggers heroes in the eyes of ordinary citizens. People whispered about secret bars like they were fairy tales. Kids passing by the street would hear faint jazz notes and imagine a world of mystery just behind the walls. Even law enforcement found itself caught in a paradox. Arresting drinkers felt silly when nearly everyone they knew was sipping secretly. Bribes flowed like cocktails, and loyalty sometimes mattered more than the law. A culture of secrets. The secrecy created a culture all its own. Passwords, knocks,
Hidden doors and back alley deliveries became part of daily life. People learned to trust intuition, spot suspicious characters, and decode a glance that said, "Everything's fine unless it's not." It was thrilling in a quiet, everyday way. For the first time, the thrill of rebellion wasn't just for gangsters, it was for everyone. Women at the bar. Prohibition also changed the nightlife for women. Before the 1920s, it was unusual for a woman to drink in public. Speakeasies changed that. Flappers and young women slipped into secret bars, laughing, dancing, and sipping cocktails. The act was daring and liberating. They weren't just drinking, they were claiming space in a society that had often tried to limit them. It was another kind of revolution, quiet, stylish, and full of jazz. The everyday thrill. Even ordinary evenings became cinematic. A couple might stroll past a darkened alley, follow the faint sound of a piano, and end up in a hidden basement alive with music. The bartender pours a drink. Someone laughs too loud. Jazz swells. Cigarettes burn slowly. Time bends. Outside, the city is normal. Inside, it's secret, thrilling, and alive. And all of it exists because of a law that told people no. The legacy of the paradox. By the end of Prohibition in 1933, people had learned a few things. Laws can shape behavior, sometimes in surprising ways. Desire often grows stronger when it's forbidden. Creativity, secrecy, and risk-taking can become cultural forces. Speakeasies, jazz, and bootleggers left a lasting imprint on American culture. They defined nightlife, music, and style for decades to come. And in some ways, the 1920s taught America a gentle lesson. The more you try to restrict something human, the more imaginative people become. A gentle reflection. So tonight, when we imagine the 1920s, we don't just see prohibition, police, or politicians. We see glowing basements, jazz spilling into dark streets, laughter that refuses to be silenced. We see people discovering freedom in small, secret ways. A wink here, a whispered password there, a sip of gin that tastes like rebellion. The Prohibition paradox reminds us that human nature is clever, curious, and sometimes quietly defiant.
The 1920s weren't just roaring with jazz, speakeasies, and gangsters. They were roaring with style. Walk down any city street in a decade and you'd see a world in motion. Skirts swishing, hats tilted just so, shoes clicking on cobblestones. Fashion was more than clothing. It was a statement, a rebellion, a declaration that life was changing and everyone was invited to the party. The flapper revolution. Perhaps the most iconic image of the decade, the flapper. Short skirts, loose silhouettes, bobbed hair, and beads that swayed with every step. The flapper didn't just dance, she defied. Gone were the tight corsets, heavy layers, and Victorian constraints. Women wanted freedom, to move, to breathe, to live, and their clothes reflected that. A flapper dress wasn't just fabric. It was liberation sewn into silk and chiffon. When she twirled at a speakeasy or Charlestoned across the dance floor, her clothes sang with the rhythm of rebellion. And those short hairstyles? The famous bob wasn't just trendy, it was revolutionary. Hair that once symbolized propriety was chopped, daring and unapologetic. Men's fashion, sharp, sleek, and self-assured. Men weren't left behind. Tailored suits became a mark of status, style, and subtle rebellion. Three-piece suits, pocket watches, fedoras tilted at just the right angle. Every detail mattered. And then came the Oxford bags, wide-legged trousers that swayed with every stride. University students and young men embraced them as both comfortable and stylish, a quiet rebellion against stuffy tradition. Shoes, hats, and ties,
Even the smallest accessory was part of the new identity. Men wanted to look modern, confident, and a little untouchable, just like the decade itself. Fashion as freedom. Why all the fuss over clothes? Because for a generation that had survived war, famine, and uncertainty, fashion was more than aesthetics. It was psychology in fabric form. Clothing became a way to declare, I am alive, I am free, I survived. Every fringe, bead, and stripe symbolized autonomy, joy, and sometimes defiance. The way a woman's dress shimmered under a club's light or the way a man's suit flared with a dance step spoke volumes about identity, self-expression, and hope. Fashion in the 1920s wasn't just skin deep, it was the soul on display. The rise of department stores. And how did everyone get their hands on these revolutionary threads? Enter the department store. Sprawling emporiums filled with fabrics, accessories, shoes, and the latest trends. Stores like Macy's and Marshall Field's became cultural landmarks. They weren't just places to shop. They were stages where people could see themselves as part of something modern and exciting. Escalators, yes, first ones, carried shoppers past mannequins adorned in the latest styles. Perfume counters, hat displays, and silk scarves tempted every eye. Even the act of shopping became a social experience, a chance to witness freedom, wealth, and creativity in action. Fashion magazines, windows to the world. Magazines played their part too. Publications like Vogue and Harper's Bazaar didn't just showcase clothes, they told stories. They inspired women and men to imagine themselves dancing in a Gatsby-inspired ballroom, strolling down a city street in a perfect ensemble, or catching a cab to a speakeasy perfectly dressed. Advertising was clever, cinematic, and aspirational. Every page whispered, you can be modern, you can be free, you can be stylish. And for a generation recovering from the shadows of war, these magazines offered a vision of hope, beauty, and possibility. Symbolism in every stitch. Clothing in the 1920s wasn't arbitrary. A flapper dress symbolized liberation and the rejection of societal constraints. Bobbed hair shouted independence and a willingness to challenge norms. Oxford bags allow movement and comfort, hinting at a playful defiance. Accents like close hats, long necklaces, and pocket watches express personality, wealth, or rebellion. Every detail told a story, not just of fashion, but of a world remaking itself after devastation. Street style meets the nightlife. Walk past a city street in the 1920s at night, and the spectacle comes alive. Couples head to jazz clubs or speakeasies. Women's fringe dresses sway under lamplight, heels clicking like tiny drums. Men's fedoras cast shadows over smirking faces. Cigarette holders add flair. Perfume and cologne mix with the smoky air. Fashion wasn't passive, it was performative. It danced, shimmered, and flirted with the city itself. Even the casual observer couldn't help but notice. The streets were alive, and the decade had a pulse you could see. The psychology of style. After years of war and economic uncertainty, the 1920s generation craved control, and they found it in clothes. Style gave them agency. They chose how to present themselves, how to move through public spaces, and how to align their appearance with their inner sense of freedom. Clothing became a form of storytelling. A flapper's dress, a man's Oxford bag, a carefully placed hat, each item whispered something about desire, identity, and rebellion. Fashion was their armor, their poetry, and their celebration, all rolled into fabric and thread. A gentle reflection. So when we picture the 1920s, it isn't just about jazz, speakeasies, or gangsters. It's about the way people dressed their dreams. It's the shimmer of a beaded dress under lamplight, the bold stride of a man in a tailored suit, the laughter that danced along with the fringe of a skirt. The decade's fashion was a mirror of its spirit, bold, modern, slightly rebellious, and infinitely alive. And just like the music, the cocktails, and the hidden nightlife, it reminds us that style is more than clothing. It's freedom, courage, and the audacity to live fully.
It's 1920. The streets hum with jazz, the speakeasies pulse with secret energy, and the city lights shimmer like a promise. But something monumental has happened. Something quieter than a trumpet, but just as powerful. The 19th Amendment has been ratified. For the first time in American history, women can vote. It's a small piece of paper, inked and official, yet its impact? Tremendous. From homemaker to citizen. Before the 1920s, many women's lives were largely confined to the home. Cooking, cleaning, raising children, respectable and dutiful work, but limited in scope. Suddenly, that world expands. Women are not just homemakers. They are citizens with a voice, a ballot, and a say in the country's future. It's a subtle revolution, not loud like a jazz trumpet, but powerful like a deep bass line that carries a song forward. And with voting comes responsibility, awareness, and most importantly, confidence. The modern woman emerges. The modern woman isn't just someone who votes. She's someone who walks into the world differently. She attends college, studies subjects once reserved for men, and dreams of careers beyond the kitchen. She joins social clubs, discusses literature, art, and politics. She speaks, she leads, she learns. She dresses to move freely, reflecting her independence. Bobbed hair, tailored suits, comfortable shoes, and daring accessories. She's stylish but practical, confident but elegant. The modern woman is a fusion of intellect, creativity, and quiet rebellion. She challenges the old norms simply by living her life fully. Social clubs and education. The 1920s saw an explosion of women's clubs and educational opportunities. Ladies' clubs offered more than gossip over tea. They became platforms for debate, philanthropy, and influence. Women could organize, vote on local issues, and even guide social change. Universities welcomed increasing numbers of female students. Libraries, lecture halls, and laboratories became spaces where ideas were exchanged, knowledge was pursued, and ambition was nurtured. Education was no longer a privilege. It was a pathway to independence. And independence, in turn, shaped fashion, lifestyle, and worldview. Elegance and quiet strength. Amidst jazz, speakeasies, and fashion revolutions, women carried themselves with quiet strength. A glance, a smile, a firm handshake. Small gestures that said, "I am here. I matter. I decide." The elegance of the modern woman wasn't in extravagance alone. It was in composure, in self-assurance, in knowing that she had survived a changing world and now had a place in it. Even in the midst of nightlife and excitement, this strength shone, unassuming but unmistakable. Changing identity through daily life. The 1920s woman wasn't simply changing politics, she was reshaping daily life. She walked the streets independently. She rode public transport without escort. She entered offices and lecture halls once closed to her. She debated, negotiated, and sometimes defied expectations. This shift created tension, sure. Traditionalists were skeptical, even disapproving. But for a generation of women, this was liberation. Quiet, everyday freedom, stitched into skirts, buttoned into blouses, and bobbed into haircuts. Even ordinary gestures, attending a theater alone, voting in local elections, or joining a social club became acts of empowerment. Symbolism in style and behavior. The modern woman's style reflected her identity. Bobbed hair symbolized independence. Simpler dresses allowed mobility and practicality. Cloche hats and accessories offered elegance without restriction. Public presence in streets, workplaces, and clubs made a statement louder than words. These weren't mere trends. They were tools of self-expression, a language that said, "I exist on my own terms." A generation rewriting rules. The women of the 1920s understood something vital.
Identity is flexible, society is changing, and influence is earned, not given. They walked into political offices, libraries, and college classrooms and left footprints that reshaped expectations. And while history often highlights the loudest voices, much of this transformation was subtle. Gestures, choices, and daily acts of autonomy that quietly redefine gender roles. The intersection of freedom and culture. Fashion, nightlife, and work weren't just aesthetic choices. They were part of a cultural shift, the manifestation of freedom, agency, and resilience. The modern woman danced at speakeasies, studied in lecture halls, debated in clubs, and voted in elections. Every action was a note in a larger symphony of liberation, and the world listened, slowly, sometimes grudgingly, but inevitably. A gentle reflection. Tonight, when we picture the streets of the 1920s, we see more than jazz, cocktails, and glitzy flappers. We see women walking tall, bobbed hair swaying, skirts moving freely, eyes bright with purpose. We hear the quiet rhythm of change, not loud, but persistent. The changing role of women in the 1920s wasn't just political or social. It was psychological, cultural, and profoundly human. It reminds us that history isn't always about battles or speeches. Sometimes it's about a glance, a vote, a class attended, a dress worn, small acts that ripple through time. And that, perhaps, is the quiet magic of this decade. A generation reshaping itself, dreaming boldly, and carrying elegance and strength in every step.
The 1920s weren't just roaring with jazz, speakeasies, and flappers. They were roaring with miracles, technological ones. Step into a quiet neighborhood in 1920. You might see a horse cart clattering down a dusty street. But wait, a shiny new Ford Model T glides past, horn honking softly, engine purring like a content cat. In living rooms across America, families huddled around a curious box, a radio. And for the first time, they hear voices, music, and stories traveling invisibly through the air. Life was changing, quietly, miraculously, and everyone could feel it. The magic of radio. Imagine a world without podcasts, YouTube, or streaming music. That's the world the 1920s radio changed. For the first time, a family could sit together and hear live music, news, or a serialized story without leaving the house. Voices floated from the speaker, strange and magical, distant announcers, jazz bands, and occasionally commercials for miracle tonics. The radio became the heartbeat of the home. Kids laughed at programs, parents discussed headlines, and the air seemed alive with possibility. Suddenly, rural and urban America shared the same songs, jokes, and news, a connection never possible before. The world felt smaller, yet bigger, all at once. Automobiles, the freedom machine. Meanwhile, cars were transforming the country in a very literal sense. The Ford Model T, affordable and reliable, gave millions of Americans mobility for the first time. Families could visit relatives miles away, teens could escape to city lights, and businesses could reach customers faster than ever before. Roads became arteries of connection. Small towns no longer felt isolated. Cities expanded, suburbs emerged, and the American landscape itself started to shift. Owning a car wasn't just convenience, it was freedom. And with freedom came exploration, curiosity, and a hint of mischief. Telephones, voices across the miles. The telephone, though not new, became more common in the 1920s. Families who once relied on letters could now hear each other's voices instantly. A mother in a rural town could speak to her son working in the city. Friends could laugh across states, and business moved faster, smoother, more personally. There was something intimate about hearing a familiar voice carried invisibly across wires. It connected hearts, ideas, and commerce. And in the 1920s, connection was magic. The transformation of daily life. These inventions didn't just make life easier, they changed how people experienced it. Imagine a rural family waking up to the sound of a radio broadcast, breakfast simmering on the stove. The father hops into his Model T to head to town. A letter arrives. No, a phone call from the city, inviting the family to a neighbor's event. Life felt immediate, exciting, connected. Technology collapsed distances, made news universal, and allowed culture to spread like wildfire. A jazz tune in New Orleans could reach a farm in Kansas within hours. A political speech in New York could be discussed in a Montana town that evening. The world was no longer fragmented. It was synchronized, humming to the same rhythm, and people felt it in their bones. Innovation and society. The magic of these technologies wasn't just practical. Radios brought culture, music, and ideas into homes. Automobiles transformed social life, education, and even romance. Think of teens sneaking out to the city, or lovers driving under moonlit skies. Telephones compressed time and space, making communication a daily thrill rather than a rare luxury. Every innovation touched life profoundly. People weren't just using technology, they were living in it, letting it reshape their routines, dreams, and possibilities. Connecting rural and urban America. Perhaps the most remarkable effect was connection. Before, rural areas were isolated. Town gossip was all you knew. News traveled slowly. Culture was localized. With radios and telephones, small-town America heard national broadcasts, sports results, and jazz bands. They laughed at the same jokes, sang the same songs, and listened to the same stories as city dwellers. Automobiles made cities reachable. Families could travel for work, pleasure, or exploration. Cities and towns started influencing each other, blending traditions, trends, and innovations. Suddenly, Americans felt part of a larger, shared world. The country was vast, yet intimate. Technology created a new kind of national consciousness. The joy of discovery. For many, these changes brought delight. Hearing your favorite singer over the airwaves for the first time, driving down a newly paved road with the wind in your hair, calling a friend and sharing news instantly. It was a kind of magic people had never experienced before. Every beep, hum, or engine roar became a symbol of progress, a miracle made tangible. And for a generation that had survived war and uncertainty, these small miracles offered hope, excitement, and a sense that the future was theirs to shape. A gentle reflection. The 1920s taught something profound. Technology isn't just about machines or inventions. It's about connection, freedom, and possibility. It's about feeling closer to someone hundreds of miles away, or seeing the world stretch out before you as the car wheels spin. The decade's miracles, radio, automobiles, and telephones, weren't just tools. They were portals to new experiences, new identities, and new ways to belong. As the night falls, imagine yourself in that era. The hum of a Model T outside, a radio telling a story in the living room, a telephone waiting to carry voices across miles. Life is bigger, smaller, faster, quieter, and somehow warmer all at once. Technology in the 1920s didn't just change America, it changed how Americans felt about the world. And in this gentle shift, we see the heartbeat of the decade, A country embracing the modern miracle, one sound, one road, and one connection at a time.
The 1920s are roaring, shimmering, full of jazz, speakeasies, and technological miracles. But not everyone felt the roar. While cities sparkled with neon, cars, and jazz, rural America moved at a quieter, slower rhythm. And in that silence, the decade's tension became clear. The great divide between old and new America. The pulse of the countryside. Picture a small town in Iowa or Kansas. The sun rises over endless fields of wheat. Farmers step into barns rather than skyscrapers. Horses still clatter on dirt roads. Children walk miles to school. Life is slow, deliberate, and tied to tradition. Seasons dictate activity. Births, marriages, and funerals mark time. The land is steady, reliable, comforting, and sometimes lonely. Unlike the city, there are no flashing lights or jazz clubs around every corner. The excitement of automobiles, radios, and speakeasies is distant, sometimes almost mythical. The emotional contrast. For city dwellers, the decade is thrilling. New clothes, new music, new freedoms. But in rural America, change feels alien. A farmer might glance at a newspaper describing a jazz festival in Chicago or a silent film premiere in New York and think, that's not our world. The contrast isn't just economic or technological, it's emotional. Cities feel alive, buzzing, modern. Farms feel rooted, steady, even lonely. And for many, that loneliness isn't just physical, it's the isolation of watching society evolve in ways they can't yet reach. The push and pull. The 1920s pull America in two directions. Progress and modernity, jazz, skyscrapers, speakeasies, automobiles, and new social freedoms. Tradition and stability, small towns, farms, community rituals, and values passed down for generations. This push and pull isn't violent, it's subtle. A farmer hears jazz on a neighbor's radio and frowns, unsure whether to join in or shake his head. A city child visits a grandparent's farm and marvels at the pace of life, so different from the modern whirlwind. Every day, Americans navigate this divide, consciously or not, choosing what to embrace, resist, or adapt. Conservative values versus modern liberalism. The tension of the decade often became a moral clash. Rural areas held tight to conservative values, religion, family, community, and frugality. Cities leaned toward modern liberalism, personal freedom, nightlife, jazz, and experimentation. It wasn't just politics, it was lifestyle, it was music, it was who you danced with, who you voted for, and even what you wore. For many, this clash produced anxiety. Church pews echoed with concern over moral decay. Farmers whispered about the dangers of city life. Parents worried over flapper girls, speakeasies, and the fast-changing social landscape. Yet, even in this tension, America was learning to coexist with difference. Rural and urban lives might diverge, but they remained threads in the same national fabric. The loneliness of tradition. Isolation wasn't just geographical. Letters were slow. Radios were new. Travel was expensive. A farmer might not hear news from the city for days. When the local dance hall played country tunes instead of jazz, he felt the gap between worlds. Still, there was beauty in this pace. Life aligned with nature, with family, with the seasons. Solitude was sometimes reflective, meditative. In the slow rhythm of rural America, a century's changes felt gradual, almost gentle, even as the cities leapt ahead. City life, a world apart. Meanwhile, cities pulsed with excitement.
Streetcars clattered, shops dazzled with window displays. Speakeasies offered secret thrills. Radios transmitted voices from thousands of miles away. For urbanites, life was fast, modern, unpredictable, and fun. For rural families, that same life could feel distant, almost mythical. And the distance wasn't just physical, it was cultural, emotional, and generational. This contrast created a subtle tension that would define the decade. The desire to join the new world, tempered by the comfort of the old. A generation between two worlds. The Great Divide wasn't just about geography, it was generational. Young people in town sometimes adopted city trends, shorter skirts, jazz music, radio shows. Older generations clung to familiar routines, resistant to sudden change. Families balanced the two worlds, tradition at home, curiosity toward modern life outside. The tension was quiet but persistent, a tug of war between past and future. Even the most conservative rural community might adopt a new technology, like a radio, before fully embracing the cultural shifts it brought. Cultural crossroads. This decade taught Americans how to navigate difference. Rural and urban, conservative and liberal, slow and fast, all coexisted. The country learned compromise, adaptation, and curiosity. The divide was not permanent. It was a phase of growth, of experimentation, and of gradual understanding. And in the quiet moments, a farmer listening to a distant radio signal, or a city worker visiting family in the country, the two worlds sometimes merged, softly, gently, and unexpectedly. A gentle reflection. The Great Divide reminds us that change is never uniform. Some rush ahead, eager for new experiences, while others stay rooted, savoring tradition. Both perspectives are valid. Both shape culture. Both are essential to understanding a nation in flux. As we drift to sleep imagining 1920s America, picture the contrast. The bustling city, alive with music, lights, and ambition. The quiet countryside, serene, steady, and enduring. Both are part of the same story, the same nation, moving forward together, even if at different paces. The decade whispers that progress and tradition need not fight, they coexist, creating depth, texture, and a story that's richer for the contrast.
The 1920s glittered with jazz, speakeasies, flappers, and Model Ts. But behind the sparkle, there were shadows. Quiet, uncomfortable truths that many didn't want to see. For every city street pulsing with excitement, there were corners of the country where life was far less kind. The decade's roar wasn't universal. Some voices were silenced, some struggles hidden. A whisper of inequality. Racism and inequality were woven into the very fabric of American life. The Ku Klux Klan resurged during this decade, spreading fear and enforcing prejudice. Their presence wasn't just in whispers. They marched, paraded, and influenced politics in ways that affected millions. Meanwhile, immigrants faced suspicion and hostility. New Americans chasing dreams of opportunity often found themselves excluded, harassed, or marginalized. Cities were vibrant, but for many, that vibrancy was only on the surface. The Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921. One of the darkest whispers of the decade, the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921. In the Greenwood District, known as Black Wall Street, a thriving community of black entrepreneurs, families, and artists lived, worked, and prospered. Their success was remarkable. It was celebrated quietly until envy and fear erupted into violence. Over 2 days, white mobs attacked Greenwood, destroying homes, businesses, and lives. Hundreds were killed, thousands left homeless, and a once thriving neighborhood was reduced to ashes. The massacre was a chilling reminder that the decade's prosperity was not shared equally. While the city danced and the jazz played, some people's lives were burned out quietly, unseen, whispered into history. Immigration tensions. Rural and urban America faced immigration tensions too. Eastern Europeans, Italians, and other newcomers often arrived with hope and ambition only to meet suspicion. Jobs were scarce. Nativist sentiment rose. Laws like the Emergency Quota Act of 1921 limited who could enter, favoring some over others. Still, immigrants contributed vibrancy, culture, and innovation to cities. They opened shops, built neighborhoods, and brought cuisine, music, and traditions that quietly shaped modern America. Yet beneath the contribution was a push and pull, welcomed for labor, but questioned for identity. A subtle struggle between acceptance and exclusion permeated daily life. The hidden struggles. The 1920s shine, flappers, jazz, cars, movies, coexisted with hardship, fear, and injustice. Many stories were hidden, quietly carried in memory or whispers. Families who lost businesses, communities that were burned, immigrants navigating prejudice. Their lives were not glamorous, but they were real. This duality made the decade complex, the bright surface of progress and liberation, and the quiet shadows of inequality, fear, and violence. Finding humanity in the shadows. Even in these dark moments, there were small lights of humanity. Neighbors helped rebuild, families persevered, and communities found ways to survive. Black Wall Street would eventually rise again, though the scars remained. Immigrant communities preserved culture, faith, and hope, passing it down quietly to future generations. The decade teaches something subtle. History isn't just the loud, flashy stories. It's also the whispers, the struggles, the resilience, and the acts of courage that often go unseen. A quiet reflection. So tonight, when we imagine the 1920s, we picture jazz, speakeasies, fashion, and innovation, but we also remember not everyone danced to the jazz. Not everyone thrived in the city lights. Some were left in shadows, working quietly, hoping, surviving. History is layered. For every sparkling skyscraper, there were streets and neighborhoods living quietly under tension. For every glamorous flapper, there were children learning resilience. For every roaring speakeasy, there were communities silenced by prejudice and fear. The decade was not just about light, it was about contrast. And recognizing that contrast helps us understand the true heartbeat of an era. The subtle humor of humanity. Even in these shadows, life continued. People argued, laughed, danced, worked, and dreamed. There were quiet moments of irony, too. City papers reporting glamorous parties while nearby towns struggled. Sometimes humor appeared in unexpected places, a bootlegging joke whispered during tense times, or a neighbor teasing about city fashions while enduring hard farm work. These small bits of human spirit remind us that even in dark times, people find ways to connect, survive, and occasionally smile. The lesson of shadows. The hidden struggles of the 1920s whisper a gentle lesson. Progress is uneven, and freedom is layered. While some enjoyed jazz, automobiles, and speakeasies, others faced prejudice, violence, and exclusion. Both stories coexist. Both deserve remembrance. By listening to the whispers of history, we see the full spectrum of an era, the bright lights, the shadows, and the human resilience that bridges the two. A gentle closure. As we close our eyes tonight, imagine the decade in full. Cities alive with jazz, laughter, and nightlife. Cars humming down streets, radios telling stories. Farms in small towns, slower, reflective, holding on to tradition. Communities struggling quietly, rebuilding, surviving, dreaming. The 1920s were not simple. They were beautiful, complex, bright, and shadowed. And in that complexity, we find truth, empathy, and understanding. It reminds us that every era has layers, and that the quiet stories, sometimes almost forgotten, are just as important as the loud, dazzling ones.
The 1920s felt endless. Cities shimmered, radios sang, cars purred down streets, and life seemed to move faster, brighter, louder than ever. Yet, beneath the roar, there was a fragile thread holding it all together. A delicate optimism that would soon face the harshest test. A time of fragile dreams. The decade encouraged belief in possibility. People believed in progress, in abundance, in personal freedom. A young couple might walk past a shiny new car showroom, dreaming aloud of the Model T they would buy. Neighbors compared radios, each claiming theirs played the best jazz. Investors whispered about stocks, feeling certain the market could only rise. Dreams were bright, abundant, almost intoxicating. And yet they were fragile, built on confidence, speculation, and hope, rather than firm foundation. Stock market mania. By the mid-1920s, the stock market became a kind of national obsession. People bought shares not just with savings, but with borrowed money, confident that prices would continue to climb. Daily life itself seemed connected to the market. Conversations at dinner tables often turned to stocks. Ticker tape machines clattered in offices, and newspapers shouted headlines of skyrocketing profits. Optimism was everywhere. It flowed through cities, small towns, even rural communities where neighbors traded stocks for the first time. Yet, like a finely tuned instrument, the market's harmony was delicate. One wrong note could ripple across the country, toppling dreams built on speculation. Daily life in the bubble. Meanwhile, life felt wonderfully ordinary. A family might wake to the smell of breakfast and a brief radio broadcast. The father hops into his car to head downtown. A child listens to a new jazz tune while polishing shoes. The mother reads fashion magazines, dreaming of flapper dresses for the next social gathering. Shops thrived. Cars, appliances, radios, and stock certificates were daily conversations. Optimism was the background music of life. People didn't talk much about risk, scarcity, or what might go wrong. They lived in the moment, believing the rhythm of prosperity would continue indefinitely. Buying cars, radios, and stocks. The consumer culture of the 1920s was thriving. Cars weren't just transportation, they were freedom, independence, and social currency. Families and young couples bought them with hope, pride, and the occasional nervous glance at monthly payments. Radios brought music, news, and entertainment into homes. Tuning into the latest broadcasts became a daily ritual, a connection to the wider world. Stocks felt like magic tickets. Everyone wanted a piece of the American dream, often without fully understanding the invisible threads holding it together. This daily optimism made the decade feel unstoppable. People laughed, danced, and spent, unaware of the storm quietly gathering on the horizon. A gentle tension. Even as life sparkled, small whispers of caution existed. Some wise observers noted overconfidence in the stock market. Farmers struggled with debt despite the urban boom. Rural communities watched the city's frenzy with distant concern. But these were whispers, quiet against the roar of celebration. Optimism dominated, and for most, the possibility of collapse felt impossible. The decade's rhythm carried everyone forward. The illusion of permanence.
The 1920s were a study in contrast between appearance and reality. City streets, radios, automobiles, and glamorous social gatherings projected abundance. People smiled, danced, and celebrated. Life seemed certain. Yet underneath, the structure was precarious. Credit was expanding, markets were inflated, and much of the wealth was concentrated in the hands of a few. A sudden shift could unsettle the illusion entirely. It was a delicate balance, dazzling, intoxicating, and easy to forget that one day the music might fade. And indeed, the music would fade. As the decade neared the end, small cracks began to appear. The stock market's rapid rise created instability. Farmers' debts lingered. International tensions simmered. The exuberance of cities, the freedom of youth, and the optimism of households existed against a backdrop of potential collapse. Life remained vibrant, full of cars, jazz, and fashion, but the shadow of uncertainty stretched quietly behind the scenes. The Great Depression was not sudden. It was the inevitable conclusion of a decade's fragile dreams. And as Americans celebrated daily life, few could sense the storm approaching, soft at first, then overwhelming. A gentle reflection. Tonight, as we imagine the 1920s, picture this delicate balance. Streets bustling with life, laughter, and music. Radios broadcasting jazz and news across the country. Families buying cars, appliances, and stock certificates with hope. A society unaware that its optimism was fragile. The decade teaches us something timeless. Joy and progress often coexist with uncertainty. Life can feel abundant and steady, yet quietly, invisible threads hold it all together. The lesson isn't meant to dampen the sparkle of history. Rather, it's a reminder to observe, appreciate, and honor both the light and the shadows. Closing thoughts. The 1920s were magical, roaring, playful, and daring. People lived boldly, creating memories, dreams, and innovations that would inspire generations. Yet the crash before the storm whispers a subtle truth. Even the brightest days can be fragile. Optimism, while beautiful, is delicate. And sometimes the lessons of history arrive not with a shout, but as a soft, reflective caution. We've walked through the 1920s together, a decade alive with jazz, cars, radios, and speakeasies. A decade of flappers, stock markets, and silent films. But we've also glimpsed the shadows, inequality, prejudice, and fragile dreams. Now, as the decade draws to a reflective close, let's pause and breathe in the full tapestry of this remarkable era. The vibrancy of daily life. The streets of cities shimmered with light. Radio sang in living rooms. Cars hummed down bustling avenues. People moved, danced, and celebrated with newfound freedom and confidence. The 1920s were about possibility. It was a time when individuals felt empowered to shape their lives, explore new cultures, experiment with fashion, and embrace technology. Even mundane things, buying a new radio, learning a dance step, or picking up the latest fashion magazine, felt infused with joy and excitement. Each action carried a sense of modernity, a feeling that the world was shifting under your feet, and maybe, just maybe, you could rise with it. Innovation and connection. Technological marvels, radios, automobiles, and telephones shrank distances, connected hearts, and gave people access to experiences previously impossible. A small-town farmer could hear jazz music from New Orleans. A teenager could drive into the city to explore nightclubs. Families could speak instantly with relatives hundreds of miles away. The 1920s taught Americans that connection matters. Even when life felt fast, overwhelming, or unpredictable, technology gave a sense of intimacy and immediacy. It allowed the nation to feel smaller, more coherent, and deeply alive. The rhythm of change. Change was everywhere. Fashion evolved. Women stepped boldly into public life, and cities pulsed with culture. Yet rural areas often remained slower, tied to tradition, and cautious about the modern world. This contrast, the urban rush versus rural steadiness, created tension, but also texture. It reminded Americans that progress isn't universal, that every era has layers, and that patience, observation, and empathy are essential for understanding history fully. Joy amid shadows. The 1920s were dazzling, but shadows lingered. Racism, inequality, immigration tensions, and fragile economic optimism existed quietly behind the sparkle. Even so, life found ways to flourish. Communities persevered, rebuilt, and created joy in small acts. Neighbors supported each other, families worked hard, and resilience became a quiet anthem of the decade. The contrast between light and shadow didn't diminish the era. It enriched it, giving depth to our understanding and showing that progress and struggle often walk hand in hand. The fragility of prosperity. The stock market, consumer culture, and technological excitement all created optimism. Yet, as we saw, this prosperity was precarious. Cars, radios, and stock certificates symbolized abundance, but the threads holding it together were delicate. The Great Depression lurked quietly beyond the horizon, a reminder that human ambition is always vulnerable to chance, overconfidence, and unseen forces. The lesson is subtle, not heavy-handed. Enjoy progress, cherish joy, but remember that every bright moment is part of a larger, complex story. The spirit of the generation. The true heartbeat of the 1920s lies in its people. Young flappers, jazz musicians, farmers, immigrants, students, and workers each contributed to a mosaic of life. They experimented, adapted, laughed, and sometimes failed. The generation embodied energy, curiosity, and resilience. Even when shadows pressed in, they created beauty, innovation, and culture that would echo through the decades. A gentle perspective. As we close our eyes tonight, imagine walking the streets of the 1920s. City streets alive with music, conversation, and motion. Rural roads, quiet, reflective, filled with the rhythm of nature and tradition. Homes with radios broadcasting stories, news, and jazz. Families, friends, and neighbors living, learning, and loving in a world at once vibrant and delicate. The decade was not perfect. It was messy, vibrant, fragile, bold, and tender. And that is precisely what makes it unforgettable. Lessons for today. The 1920s remind us of timeless truths. Change is constant. Life evolves in cities, countrysides, and hearts alike. Joy and struggle coexist. Even amid hardship, humans create laughter, music, and art. Connection matters. Technology, relationships, and shared culture shape experience. And resilience endures. Communities and individuals persist through challenges, quietly or loudly. History isn't just about dates, inventions, or events. It's about the rhythm of daily life, the heartbeat of people, their choices, dreams, and small acts that ripple through time. A gentle goodbye to the decade. Tonight, as the jazz fades and the streets grow quiet, we leave the roaring decade with a gentle sigh. We carry its music, fashion, innovation, and lessons. We carry the stories of people dancing, voting, driving, creating, struggling, and dreaming. And perhaps most importantly, we carry the reminder that history is alive. It whispers through streets, echoes in homes, and hums in radios long forgotten. The 1920s were a tapestry of light and shadow, excitement and reflection, progress and fragility. And in that tapestry, every life, city dweller, farmer, jazz musician, or silent observer, mattered. So, as we drift off to sleep tonight, imagine the decade one last time. Cars gliding down streets under street lamps. Jazz spilling from open windows. Radios telling stories of faraway places. Families, friends, and neighbors living, learning, and loving in a world at once vibrant and delicate. The Roaring Twenties were a chapter in a story bigger than any one person. They remind us that life is a mixture of adventure, risk, joy, and reflection, and that even when the storm comes, the human spirit carries forward. And with that thought, we close our eyes, carrying the echoes of a decade that roared softly, laughed gently, and left an indelible mark on history.